history of Vauxhall Motors to present day. So I'm sure a lot of you already know the book, and if you haven't, you should definitely go check it out. It's also in the library. Yes, it's what we're doing today. So I will hand over to Len, and if you have any questions or queries, you can come and give me a shout, and I'll be happy to answer them. I'll just be like in the back.
Okay.
Right, thank you very much.
Thanks, Aisha. Okay, as Len Holden, I've written an academic book on Vauxhall Motors. There are lots of books with pictures of cars and captions and so on, not much analysis. So I hope to actually fill that gap, okay, in giving this talk today. Vauxhall Motors, although it's gone, it's actually a company that lasted for over 100 years, and that's quite something. A lot of companies don't last that long, and famous companies all have been and gone in the world economy, and Vauxhall did well to last as long as it did. Its origins has been very much, can you see, am I in the way? Okay, I'll move that back a bit. Its origins started not with motor cars, but with actually engines for boats, or pinnaces as they call them, plied up and down the River Thames. So it's been through several companies making engines for boats, and later on it actually made all things like donkey feeds and things like that. Then it moved on to cars initially, and it went through a hell of a lot of changes through its lifetime. And we hope to actually get through them in the next hour as quickly as I can. It was founded in 1857, so you could say it's actually more than 100 years old. If you go right back, it's actually weighs about 170 years old. And it was founded by a Scotsman called Alexander Wilson, and it was in Wandsworth Road, Lambeth, near the old gardens. That's why the name Vauxhall, actually, as you know, came out. And the firm, as we said, produced engines and pinnaces and other craft, and it came to be known locally as Vauxhall. Wilson also produced pumps of all types, boilers, air compressors, donkey engines, water feeders, later diversified into refrigeration. So it's actually a very diversified initially company. But Alexander Wilson was hopeless. He was a good engineer, but a hopeless manager. It's said that he had lots of envelopes all over his desk, which was complete chaos. And it had written on the back of the envelopes, must pay so-and-so or whatever. So eventually, it actually went into kind of a decline, there's no doubt about it, because he could not run the company very well. Here's the Jaguar, one of Wilson's first petrol engine on the Thames. But later on, in the late 19th century, a guy called Hodges, Frank William Hodges, if I'm getting it right, there he is. He was the chief of the drawing office, and later on became the chief engineer. And Hodges got hold of a Mercedes car, pulled it to pieces and said, I could make one of those. And in a corner of the Vauxhall Works in London, he built one of the first Vauxhall cars. And it was actually quite successful in a way. The company, Alexander Wilson, by that time, the 1890s had long gone. He was kind of heave-hoed out, and he was replaced by William Gardner on the left, and the managing director, Alfred Ash, and general works manager on the right. So, this was the first car that, if you like, they produced in 1903, and it was designed by Hodges, as we've said. It was a single-cylinder engine taken from the boat petrol engine design, and it's called a voiturette, which is a French word for small car, and it costs £150. Can you imagine a car that day? And here it is. It had no steering wheel, it had a tiller, okay, instead of a steering wheel, and it had 2 forward gears, but no reverse. So if you wanted to go backwards, you would have to get out and push it, okay? All right, top speed, 25 miles an hour. In those days, early car design was very much based upon horses and coaches. And you can see this rather antiquated design, designed for the Earl of Ranfurly, whoever he was. The driver sits at the back. Its design, like many early vehicles, was influenced by the horse and carriage. And as you can see, the passengers sit inside and he's driving it from the back. It looks terribly unsafe. You can imagine. Right, Vauxhall in London actually was finding it was running out of space. So it was looking for somewhere to move to with space. And obviously what came up was Luton. And why Luton? Well, Luton at the time was looking to diversify from straw hats, which was predominant in the town, to other kind of businesses. And Luton also was trying to attract people with cheap rates, cheap rates and cheap labour. The availability of electricity, one of the first towns to electrify, closeness to London and Luton, and it was on a main railway line. So it had a lot of advantages. And the town council pushed this in advertisements in London and elsewhere. Vauxhall saw it and they thought, this is the place where we want to go. And they bought this factory, which was next to the West Hydraulic factory, and they began to actually work from there. In 1906, as you can see, the cars were getting bigger. This is one of its major problems later. And this was an 18 horsepower model because it's got a lady driver there, okay? And this was a bit unusual, but not fantastically unusual. And she is sitting in the car, and it was their first serious offering in their now Luton-based factory. Note the fluted bonnet, which became a Vauxhall, obviously, design, which was built into cars and became very well known. And that was the hallmark for over 60 years. A range of cars, by this time, by the sort of 1910 period, a range of cars were being built at Luton. You see it's very countrified around Luton. All that was to be actually taken over as the works expanded. This time, once again, the management changed. Okay? And Leslie Holden was brought in, and he was the chairman of Vauxhall and joint managing director. And Percy Keatner, who later on had lots of fame through rallies and motor racing, he became the joint managing director. He was the admin finance man, he was the engineering side. Okay? So they had a nice balance. Okay? And they became known as Vauxhall Motors Limited in 1907, issued shares. Unfortunately, the shares were not taken up as much as they wanted, and they separated from West Hydraulic, which became a separate company. The 1909 car was a 16 horsepower, still quite large, racer. And there it is, a beautiful car. And that sold quite well. In between, later on, as you can see, there's Hancock and Percy Keatner at the wheel of this 12 to 16 horsepower Vauxhall, the first car to make a journey of 2,000 miles. So they're entering into rally. This was a great way of marketing cars. If you could get cars onto rallies and win, or get near to first places, or get placed, you actually get a lot of publicity, and this is what they hope to do. The trouble was that these two guys, brilliant rally drivers though they were later to spend too much time doing the rallying and not enough time doing car production. And this became a problem. So there we go, Percy Kidner and A.J. Hancock. He was works manager, he was managing director. Kidner was described by a later head of engineering, a guy called Boris Platt, who wrote a very interesting book about his time at Vauxhall and other car companies. And he knew Kidner very well, and he said Kidner was a robust car enthusiast. He was opinionated, inflexible, and not particularly intelligent. So, you know, and so on. And this was later to be a weakness of Vauxhall in the 1920s. So, what was the initial reasons for Vauxhall's success? Firstly, it had a steady but not overextended rate of capital accumulation. In other words, they ploughed the profits back into the company. What they put on the stock market didn't really wasn't taken up much on the stock market. So they ploughed their profits. That's where they got the money from. Secondly, they had a balanced managerial board. With Walton, you had a guy who's good on the admin side. With Kidner and Hodges, who was later moved out, you had people who were good at engineering. Thirdly, solid engineering background to produce engine and chassis. And fourthly, they adapted to market changes, okay, and conditions. And finally, the man who made Vauxhall, Lawrence H. Pomeroy. And that's him there. He was a genius in many ways. His car designs were later to become revered throughout the car world. And to have one of his cars like a Prince Henry or a 3098 is considered very much a collector's item. Pomeroy designed the C-Type, it's called the C-Type, Prince Henry and the 3098. He worked along with Percy Kidner, and they used to go sometimes, mainly Kidner, abroad to Germany on rallies, and Hancock even decided to go into car racing itself and was often seen at the Brooklands here in 1910 with one of the Vauxhall cars. This one's the 20 horsepower. Obviously not a car for the road and not a car for general sales. And this was the most famous car designed by Pomeroy, the famous Prince Henry, the C-Type, designed in 1911. And it was revered by, as we see, a lot of people. Here's Pomeroy at the wheel of a prototype Prince Henry at Lynmouth in Devon in 1908. How did they produce cars? Well, they produced cars probably up to the early 20s in what's called batch production. After that, basically, most people follow Ford or General Motors having assembly flow lines, which later Vauxhall developed. But batch production was how it was done. And so the engines, the chassis, the bodywork, the trimming, all of that had different kind of shops under batch production, where people actually worked on benches. So you could not make a lot of cars that way. It was limited in a way. In a way that was quite good because Vauxhall was keeping in line with its market demand. So that wasn't a bad thing. This is the engine shop. This was the Ford shop, where some parts were made on site. Okay. This was the body shop. Much of it was customised work. And this was the paint shop. And so on. It was, as you can see, no masks at all, quite dangerous. Health and safety would have a fit today. People using paint in that way. But they used to have on some models up to 6 coats of paint. So they were very, very, if you like, very sleek productions. This is the erecting shop where the chassis and the wheels were put together, and that's the mounting shop where bodies met the chassis. Okay? And finally, this was the running shop where the engines were tested, and then the final class were taken off the assembly line, lined up, and often go on test runs, road testing. And that was the general production of Vauxhall at that time. So let's have a look at a few statistics. As you can see, it's priced 150 by 1920. Let's go to 1913. About £650. Quite an increase in price. So the market was towards middle class people, doctors, people who are professionals, accountants, people who own their own businesses and whatever. So it was quite a middle class market, as was the market generally before the First World War. Working class, lower middle class people couldn't afford these cars. Okay. So, as you can see, this was the production. As you see that they also got bigger and bigger in size. The biggest was the B12, 35 horsepower, 6 cylinders, 650, produced in 1916. Car output. Well, as you can see, 43 in 1903, not many. 1905, 1. Why? They were moving from London to Luton, so obviously they were setting up the works. By about 1930, just before the First World War, the production had gone up to 387. Employees from 150 right up to 575 to keep in line with the production that was required. This, for all car economists, is the most important statistic. Output per employee, or it's known as productivity. And that's the one thing we are bad at in Britain. We are not very productive. We don't produce. And that's one of the problems that Vauxhall face later. Okay, profits, as you can see, 12,000. The nearest rival to Vauxhall was Sunbeam. Very similar cars produced for a similar market. Sunbeam increased its profitability and its capitalisation, but Vauxhall limped behind as well. So that was its main rival. Okay, the First World War happens. Production of most cars ceased except this army vehicle. 2,000 were built for the army, and this is the most famous picture of Vauxhall with General Allenby entering Jerusalem in December 1917 in a D-type Vauxhall car with the flute on the bonnet. And there's an Arab chap tracing beside the car itself. Lawrence Pomeroy's Vauxhall 1398, perhaps, in some of the eyes of some, the finest car produced by Vauxhall in engineering achieved. It achieved many sporting successes, but it ceased production in 1926. And as I said earlier today, it's highly prized by collectors. This is the Vauxhall Wensum, a variation of the 1398. And it's a smaller car slightly, and that was built in 1923. As you can see, this is a sad picture. From 1914 to 1929, the Vauxhall profits actually began to go down considerably, and it began to make losses. And this is when it was very much in trouble. Why? Well, basically, although car output did increase, and the number of employees, well, it went up and down. As you can see, over 2,000 down to 1,500 by 1929. And the floor acre had expanded, but basically Vauxhall was in trouble. By the mid-1920s, they had unsound managerial policies. Kidner and Hancock were hanging on, hoping that the big cars would sell, so did Walton. The resumption of competitive racing was bad. Once it had been good for marketing, now it actually took a lot of money, and so they stopped it. And they were producing the wrong type of models. This is the Vauxhall R-Type 1927, and as you can see, it's a big car, and its rival was the Rolls-Royce and the Daimler, but it wasn't a rival in engineering terms. They were far superior, so it was in trouble. So it's the wrong car at the wrong time. The 25 horsepower S-Type, again, too big, trying to compete in a market of upper class, and it wasn't selling that well. So, what was to happen to Vauxhall? How did it survive? This is the question. It tried all kinds of things. The biggest car it ever produced was the Silent 80, up to 1933, sold at 750 pounds, went down perhaps to 565 later. They were very expensive, £1,300, £1,900, too expensive for ordinary people. What happened was, it was saved by the Americans, by General Motors. Here's a man, James D. Moody, head of General Motors overseas operations. The Americans were looking for some company to get behind British tariff barriers, and of course at that time we had an empire tariff barriers. If they could build a factory in Britain and build cars, they could export them to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Europe, and so on. It would be big for General Motors. So what happened was that he persuaded Alfred P. Sloan, was head of General Motors in Detroit. They've got to buy somewhere. They approached Austin asked too high a price. They approached Morris said, well, we're interested, but in the end they didn't go along with the Americans. So the Americans turned to an ailing company, Vauxhall, and they said, right, we'll buy Vauxhall. And they bought Vauxhall Motors, and this was an attempt to actually enter the British market. General Motors had been selling their own American cars in Britain, the Chevrolet 490, but it was very expensive because if you brought it in, very high tariff barriers, that meant the price was high and people wouldn't buy it. So it was not doing very well. They had a site at Holden where they actually produced them. They had a Chevrolet truck, again something later about that truck, and a Chevrolet bus as well. So in other words, they were using Chevrolet car chassis, which were big, and engines, to produce commercial vehicles. That's Alfred P. Sloan. He was a man of few words. As you can see, looks very grim, doesn't he? You know. And Alfred P. Sloan was sceptical about buying Vauxhall. He said, it's a piddling little firm, why should we buy that? But Mooney, who was head of overseas operations at GM, persuaded him with very convincing arguments. So, the British motor press went bananas when they found Vauxhall, a British well-known mark, a British well-known make, is being bought by the Yanks. This is terrible. So, they actually decided to condemn General Motors in the press, and there was a lot of British nationalism, waving the flag and all that. We can't have our wonderful Vauxhall Motors bought by the Yanks. So Vauxhall Motors was bought by General Motors, so they kept the American profile low. So they brought in Charlie Bartlett, who had worked at Hendon. He knew the business General Motors side, and they made him managing director. And Mooney said, wow, he said, Charlie Bartlett, he's about as British as they come. So he was made head of the new Vauxhall, owned by GM. Bartlett had been, as we said, a senior manager at Holden. The GM investment in Vauxhall, they expanded the Luton plant, they pumped a lot of money in, and probably based, the first car they produced was the Cadet. It's probably based on a German car, Opel, because on top of buying up Vauxhall, General Motors also bought up Opel. The following year, they bought Vauxhall in 1925, they bought Opel in 1926. So they owned a German company and a British company. And this was based on probably a German design. Okay, but it didn't sell very well. And the Cadet was priced at 280. The one that was most successful was the Light 6, and later the Big 6 here. And as you can see, the prices have come down considerably when you compare it with the 1920s big cars they were producing. This is the Light 6. As you can see, it's much more of a family car. It's affordable for people, particularly middle-class professionals, or, you know, shall we say, upper working class, lower middle class. And they produce them at 12 and 14 horsepower. In 1938, they produced an even smaller one, the H-type, at 10 and 12 horsepower. And that was also a very good seller. But the thing that made Vauxhall profitable was not cars alone. It was mainly trucks. And General Motors brought in their techniques of how to sell trucks and how to make them. This is a Bedford 1200 weight truck. Reg Pearson, whom before he died, he was, as you know, joint managing director with Charlie Bartlett at one time. Before Reg died, I interviewed him and he said to me, the truck was a lifesaver for Vauxhall. It was based on a Chevrolet chassis. It probably had a Chevrolet designed engine. They brought American engineers over from Detroit to redesign it and so on. But the clever thing about it, well, there you are, that's it. So you can see how Vauxhall increased its cars production and its CV production. As you can see, at times, the CVs were outselling the cars. 31,000, 28,000. It's only by 1938 that the cars began to supersede the commercial vehicles. So, what was the techniques they used? Well, in the marketing department of General Motors, they had statistics, they had statistic sheets, they had sales potential of light trucks to small traders like greengrocers, fishmongers and other traders. And they worked out, they did it all statistically, that if you went round Britain, you revealed that there were 6 greengrocers every 10,000 of the population in the country. That's a lot of trucks you can sell. Okay? So they then sent out field men, as they call them, to these counties round Britain, to each area, and they, on top of that, said to these greengrocers, right, you want to buy a truck, you can't afford it. Don't worry, you can have it on the Never Never if you join the General Motors Acceptance Corporation plan. In other words, we'll give you you can have the truck now, and you pay instalments over a couple of years, whatever. And they sold very well. It's reckoned that, let's take one county, Leicestershire, they calculated A.F. Palmer Phillips, he was British, but also inured with the sales of techniques of General Motors. He actually calculated there were 359 grocers in Leicestershire, 209 greengrocers, 90 butchers, 84 fishmongers, 71 bakers, 44 chemists, 38 milkmen and dairymen, a total of 995 potential buyers. You replicate that around every county, that's a lot of trucks. Okay, and so these were the sort of typical trucks that small business people tended to buy, and so they were very popular. Also, Hendon also said, what you've got to do is make your showrooms nice, make them look nice, clean, have better letter painting, repaint the showrooms, improve the room fitments, to make it look as though this is a place that is good to buy a product. They also cozied up to local newspaper editors and motoring correspondents to make sure their products were fully, and here's some of the kind of things that would do. This is Vauxhall Trade Magazine and Advertisement. The Vauxhall Motorists. And they would send those out to newspapers and magazines, car magazines and so on. So, in fact, this was, they would also train the salesmen very much to actually in selling techniques. And they said that you don't want to oversell. Listen to the customer. Listen to what they want. Don't try and sell and gabble away for an hour. You've got to actually find out what they want. And they would have frequent conferences with the salesmen to improve their techniques. Now, management style was also interesting because Vauxhall had very few strikes compared with other companies like Ford, Morris and Austin and so on. And it was said that this was because of the management style. Charlie Bartlett, I suppose, was given a free hand in this area. But the main key was Ford wanted to control everything, Henry Ford. General Motors said no, we'll devolve our control systems, or management systems, shall we say, to where they're produced. So if it's Chevrolet, Cadillac, they have their own kind of managerial systems. So they operated in that way. The Fordist style of management is very much more centralised, central control. Charlie Bartlett was very good in this area. There's no doubt he was a very, very good manager indeed. And because of the peacefulness, there's no industrial disputes, right up to the 1960s, it was known as the turnip patch amongst other trade unions. And the industrial relations were said to be very good. I interviewed shop stewards, I interviewed communist shop stewards who actually told me that reluctantly, I've got to admit, Charlie Bartlett was a bloody good manager. And they said that he was one of the key to its success. So Vauxhall profits, in fact, increased incredibly, and from losses in 1929, they began to actually have profits. By 1937, 1,159,000 profits. Amazing. And their output was also very good. If you compare it with Standard, Roots, Ford, Morris, Austin, and others, its share of the market increased gradually, about 10%. Okay, that was equivalent round about Roots and Standard, just below Ford, and Morris and Austin were the two dominants. Okay, with 24% and 21%. The war, of course, Vauxhall once again had to change over to war production, and they produced the Churchill tank. We won't dwell there. There is a picture of one. They produced many of those, and Bedford army trucks, which were seen all over the world. The Bedford Jeep was another one, which was sold to the army. And so, if you look at their wartime production, 27,000 army trucks, 5,640 Churchill tanks, camouflage aircraft hides, decoy aircraft, 5 million jerry cans, amazing. 4 million venturi tubes for rocket projectiles, and 750,000 steel helmets. Okay, after the war, they had to get back into peacetime production quick. Also, the newly elected Labour government in 1945 wanted exports. We want exports because the country's in financial problems, it owes a lot of debts, and by exporting we can help pay off those debts. So the old 1930s cars were revamped a bit. This was a Vauxhall 12, given a facelift, as they said, for the new market. This was a Vauxhall Wyvern, as you can see, still kind of 1930s styling approach. But what happened was that Ed Riley, an American who became head of General Motors Overseas organisation, wanted to wrest back control of Vauxhall from Charlie Bartlett. And there was real problems. When I interviewed Reg Pearson, he asked me several times, stop the recording, because I'm going to tell you something I don't want to be known. But I can tell you now, this is long dead. And he said, Bartlett and Riley hated each other. And when I went through the Vauxhall minutes, there was a disagreement between Riley and Bartlett. And he said, disagreement, they were nearly at one another's throats. You know, it never quite conveyed, you know, the angry kind of exchanges. But Bartlett realised that the Americans, they provided the money, the cash, and they would take back control. And so Bartlett won the argument. GM began to say, right, we want to mass produce now. We're going to expand the plant, which they did. And the Luton site was increased by 40%. In the 1950s, the Luton plant really, once again, had reached full capacity, and they were wondering where they could produce trucks. So they bought a site in nearby Dunstable to produce Bedford trucks. And the cars were produced in Luton, and the Bedford trucks were produced in Dunstable from 1955 onwards. They also produced vans, a CA van, which was highly popular in the 1950s, and it had a square engine, it was a bestseller, and it retailed at a reasonable £480. It was often adapted for holiday purposes, like a camper van. Here's one in Czechoslovakia, in Prague, and people would use them to sleep in a traveller. So very popular. There was a further expansion of the Vauxhall site in 1960. It's an aerial view. As you can see, it's gradually taking over much of the surrounding area and the town. It was because it's hilly round here, they had to dig out the hills in order to expand it, you know, and this was quite a task. By the end of the 50s, there was now a fully working modern assembly line. And this is the paint shop in 1961. And Vauxhall needed to expand even once again. So in 1962, they expanded to Ellesmere Port, up near Liverpool. And this later was to produce the Vauxhall Astra, more or less solely. The Vauxhall Cresta was probably one of its first new stylings after the war. E-type, 1951 to 1957 it was produced. And it was probably, you can see the GM influence here with the white wall tyres and the kind of, you know, Vauxhall streaks on the side and so on. This one is even more. The Vauxhall Victor was very much influenced. Maurice Platt, as I've said, the senior engineer at the time, said making this was a nightmare. He said because the wraparound windows at the front let in rain, let in air, and they had to solve these problems before they could actually produce them in mass production. But they're very popular. Here's one, Vauxhall Victor Mark II, fluted bonnet, was dropped from this design, so gradually that was being phased out. Here you can see the kind of car which General Motors produced in America. This car is a Cadillac sedan DeVille, and it was designed by the great motor designer Harley Earl. Harley Earl, I think, should be really, well, he is, regarded as one of the greats. As you can see, white wall tyres, fins, white roof, and so on and so forth. And you can see them in a lot of American movies. Chrome was very much to the fore. However, that kind of design would be too over the top for British markets. So the nearest we got to that was really the TBA Velux here, which is, as you can see, very much influenced by Harley Earl's designs, but it was much more palatable for the British market. I always wanted one of those, never did get one, but I used to love that car. Okay, so the designs you can see were coming on tap: Wyvern, Velux, Cresta, Victor, Viva, Ventura, and finally the Viva, and so on. And these models were continually updated. What was considered to be a built-in obsolescence, of cars, so that you would buy a new one every year because the design was slightly changed. This was very much a General Motors initiative. Okay, and there you can see the Vauxhall Cresta 1962 and the Vauxhall Cresta in 1950. Quite a contrast in styles under planned obsolescence. Okay, so output increased enormously by 1970. Well, actually, you can see 1965, 333,000 cars were produced. Okay, a total output with CVs, 220,000 cars, and that was really the kind of height of General Motors' Vauxhall production in those terms. CVs began to tail off a bit, actually, by the 1960s, early 1970s. This was the new Viscount, and this was the Viva, and there was now a range of cars from 1.1 litre to 3.3. The Viva, unfortunately, wasn't well received by the motoring press, described as ugly and less than fun to drive by some correspondents. And some of the designs were not really well produced. I'll give you an extract from my book, okay, of the criticism. It was said by this guy called Roach, who was a motoring journalist. The FE range, Victor and Ventura was not a sales success. In road reports there were complaints of the noisy gearbox, 4-speed, poor gear change and clutch pedals at different heights from other pedals. The OHC engine had potential but was rather thirsty, and the 3.3 litre engine was heavy and outdated. So Vauxhall car design was going through a bad time by the mid-1970s. The Ventura was another one that was not well received and not a great success, and unfortunately it was produced during the oil crisis in the 1970s, as we all remember it. How are we doing for time? Okay, I've got to hurry on. Okay, so what happened was, you can see that they began to lose money. If they're in brackets, it means they've made a loss. Okay, and it wasn't until 1987 that once again Vauxhall began to make profits again. And what was the reason for that? Another car design came on tap. First of all, the Chevette began the rescue, a small family car, quite successful in sales. But of course, the main car design that began to revive Vauxhall's fortunes was the Cavalier. And I had several of these. I thought it was a lovely car, and so on. And that was what turned their fortunes around. In essence, it was an Opel Ascona. So what was happening was another trend. Car design was not taking place in Britain, in Luton. It was now being taken from Opel in Germany. And so it was considered to be more of a German car, badged under Vauxhall. It was replaced by the Vectra, which was also not so good. So these cars came in: Viva Chevette, Cavalier, Carlton, Astra, Nova, Belmont, Omega, Corsa, Vectra, Severa, and Tigra, fairly much up to date. And Corsa is still being produced in Spain, by the way, under its new owners, Stellantis. The Astra was another resounding success. Produced in 1980, but mainly at Ellesmere Port, and was very, very popular until it ceased production in 1920. It went through a number of style changes, as we all know. We had Astras, and we had Cavaliers. We also had Belmonts as well. I was very loyal to Vauxhall. That's the Astra Mark VI, which was very much a bestseller for both General Motors, and when General Motors sold to what became Stellantis, was also a good seller for them as well. And as we said, it finally ceased production in 2022. In the 1980s, to help with production, Japanese techniques were brought in, as they were in all car firms. And this included TQM, Total Quality Management, Kanban, and Just-in-Time or JIT. All of these were techniques which meant that the car production would be very well. Team working was brought in under TQM, and so on. The unions went along with this. When I interviewed my union subjects, and they said they really bowed to a lot of what the Vauxhall General Motors management wanted to say. And they went along with this, and they did their best to actually make the car, without any interruptions in production, although there have been strikes, of course. Vauxhall Vectra, which replaced the Cavalier, was not received very well, and it was a step backwards in many ways. And the Vauxhall Motoring Press, and again I make a quotation here, said it was probably the worst car produced by Vauxhall along with the Victor. And if you want, here's a quote from Jeremy Clarkson, about it, and also Quentin Wilson. He said, in today's market, when brands are king, Vauxhall becomes worthless. And the reason why? Vauxhall has zero affection and zero brand following, that the public intuits that they don't really make cars. They assemble cars designed in Germany. They're really Opels. There is no such thing as a Vauxhall researcher, designer or engineer anymore. It's just an assembly plant for something else. It's a long time since Vauxhall had any design or integrity. Okay, so that was actually, in a way, a bit harsh, I think, but a lot of truth in it. And this was not very well received at all. And sales began to decline. On top of that, the Bedford truck was not doing very well. And in fact, there were redesigns, the Rascal van, the Frontera truck as well. They sold reasonably well, but not enough to actually make it profitable. And in the end, they said that the truck plant in Dunstable would be sold. Anyway, they also said that in 2001 GM announced that car production would eventually cease at the Luton plant. So the Vauxhall, Vivaro or Renault Traffic were the only vehicles producing quantity at the Luton plant. The Luton workforce numbered about 800 at this time. I think that's amazing. When you think at the time of Vauxhall height on its three sides, it employed 37,000 men and women. And then in Luton alone, it was up to 33,000 at one point. It's suddenly down to 800. What an incredible decline. So that's a great shame. And this was the reason. So why was there Vauxhall in decline? Well, we've seen some of the signs were already there in the 1970s with bad car design, and the fact that really the British ceased designing new cars. Their car designs came from Opel, Cavalier and Astra in particular. There were strike, stop-go policies in the 1970s, and that's true there were, which made for an uncertain market. The European market as a whole was becoming an important region. And the centre of GM operations, therefore, was moving to Germany, to Opel. At this time, Ford, General Motors, Japan, they were looking for a world car, a car that would sell in every country in the world. Besides, before that time, tariff barriers stopped cars coming in. As you know, Donald Trump has reintroduced that, hasn't he? But tariff barriers created a situation where car sales were limited and so on. And General Motors could see that, so they were looking for areas, and of course, Europe was one area they were looking to. You could say actually that Cavalier could have been a world car, but anyway. So the Luton plant was never as productive as others, as we come back to that productivity question. How many cars produced per man? And it became essentially a screwdriver plant where they assembled Opel vehicles badged under Vauxhall. One thing they did do, which was greatly in advance, was produce an electric car, the Ampera. And this was Vauxhall GM's first all-electric car with a range of 360 miles. It's amazing. And that was produced in 2015-16. And Quentin Wilson said it was a game changer. Unfortunately, it was too far ahead of its time. They should have gone in with Elon Musk or something, but not go in with him actually, but you know. So anyway, however, General Motors ceased production in 2015 due to low sales. Was it ahead of its time with this car? Anyway, 2017, Vauxhall Opel was sold to Group PSA Peugeot Citroën. In 2019, PSA Group merged with Fiat Chrysler Automobiles, and in 2020 they announced a new name, Stellantis, and that's their logo. This became the fourth largest automaker in the world after Toyota, Volkswagen and Hyundai. So that's basically the story. Vauxhall's registered office is now Pinley House in Coventry. It's unbelievable. In November 2024, Stellantis announced they were closing entirely the Luton plant and concentrating all electric production at Ellesmere Port. All petrol cars were now going to be transferred to European plants. This would lead to the loss of 1,100 jobs. The Luton factory closed on the 28th of March 2025. There were protests, quite rightly. I would have been there if I'd have been available, protesting, but it was, unfortunately, the world market had defeated them. The Ellesmere plant, there it is, continues to produce electric vehicles under Stellantis. The Vauxhall site was sold to Goodman. Is that still the case? Yeah. a global property group, who said they would work with Luton Council to actually create a community project with high quality housing and a commercial and industrial park. They hope to attract businesses from a whole range. When I finished my book, I said to myself, with the Vauxhall plant going, where are the jobs in Luton? It's quite interesting. These small industrial parks are the key to the future. This is where it is. It all disappeared into, these kind of parks. And that's the future, really. Small firms, often working with computerisation and so on. The age of the large factories, except, for a few products, seems to have disappeared, or is disappearing. Well, anyway, can I say thank you very much for listening? I think we just managed it, okay? In time. Yeah, thank you.
If anyone has any questions, I would just like to open up the floor to questions, and and if not, then I think, is there any questions?
Can I just say, there's so much I haven't touched on. First of all, finance and so on, industrial relations, that's a whole thing. I could do a university course for a whole semester just on Vauxhall. There's so much in there and so on. And we must remember it's a microcosm, not just of Vauxhall and Luton, but of the whole of Britain and all the car plants. We're now dominated by Japanese car plants and so on. Ford's still around, but not doing so well. Okay. Any questions at all?
Just
Andy. First Andy, then you.
Yeah, go on.
You should talk to people about your booklet, because I highly recommend it.
Okay.
You won't get a new copy, I don't think, but you will get it from a library and you'll get second-hand copies. And it was the basis, I think, for your thesis, is that right, Len?
That's right, yeah. My thesis.
So it's a sort of statistical stuff, but some of the things you've seen on there, but it's extremely informative. And if you sit that alongside Ian Cooper's book, which is much more about, the vehicles and so on, you've got probably the best.
I'm not an expert on the vehicles.
No, but they're probably the best two that I've read anyway. So.
Somebody asked me, they said, I've got something wrong with my cabinet. Carburettor. You know all about Vauxhall, don't you, Len? I said, I don't know anything about the engine.
You just said it's a carburettor.
Anyway, yes.
How did the name Bedford arrive?
Bedford?
Yeah.
Basically from Bedford.
No, it's simple as that.
Yeah, simple as that. Yeah. Always looking for kind of catchy name and so on.
In the very early days, you mentioned they went round Greek. Was there a dealer network, or was it all done from the manufacturers?
Oh no, there were dealer networks. That's what General Motors set up. That's what they were big at. Marketing. General Motors were amazing. That's why they eventually outsold Ford, because, and Ford, they were initially copying Ford, and then later on, Ford were copying General Motors.
Because in Luton, had 3 dealers at one time.
Yeah.
Plowman's had...
They're all franchises. Pardon?
Plowman's had the 1938 racing car.
All right.
And apparently it still exists in France somewhere.
Oh, right, yeah.
It was on the show, Plowman show, many, many years ago, I was a boy.
Yeah.
I think it was at Monterey or somewhere, and it was on a show years and years. And last I heard, it still exists somewhere in France.
Oh, right.
God knows what the value is.
Anyway, thank you very much. If you want to know more, there are lots of books on Vauxhalls. There's also mine. It's retailing at a very cheap price of 40 quid. Unfortunately, it's an academic book, and the academic press always raises the price. So sorry about that, but it'll be available in the library. Thank you for listening once again, and safe journey home. Okay.
Thank you.
Just quickly before you guys go, if you would like to give any feedback, please do so. There's space at the front. All right, thank you
Thanks,
very much,
Sasha.
guys.